Hi, everyone. If you're joining us, we are going to get started in just 1 minute, just waiting for some additional people to join the webinar. All right, we're going to get started. So good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Harris, and I am with the Metropolitan Planning Council, a planning and policy organization dedicated to shaping a more equitable, sustainable, prosperous, and civically engaged Chicago region. On behalf of MPC and the Chicago Community Trust, welcome to the Equitable Financial Incentives webinar. Yesterday, MPC released research and recommendations on the need to center equity and how development is funded in the city of Chicago. The use of financial incentive programs can be incredibly influential in stimulating development that brings new jobs, retail, housing, and amenities to communities. We strongly believe that their use should be rooted in equity, with outcomes tied to ensuring that everyone lives in a thriving community. Our research shows how and where 6 incentives have been used in Chicago over the past 10 years and is available through an interactive website, which we hope you all received a link to yesterday. And I'm going to drop it into the chat as well. Today's event will feature an overview of the Equitable Financial Incentives Project and its research findings, an exploration of the website, and a facilitated exercise using a tool called Mentimeter, where we will ask participants to provide input on the draft recommendations for increasing equity in the use of incentives. So that we can all engage easily in today's event, here are a few housekeeping points. We have enabled the Q&A function here on Zoom. You can find it at the bottom portion of your screen. We ask that you use the Q&A function to post any questions so that we can easily access them. We will try to answer them during the program, but if we don't have time for all of them, answers will be provided as part of an email follow-up. The event also features live closed captioning in English, so please click closed captions to turn the English captions on and off. We'd also like everyone to know that this event is being recorded. We will share a link to the recording and any relevant resources in a follow-up email, so keep an eye out for that. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. I'm going to start with Mike. Mike Davidson is the Senior Director at the Chicago Community Trust, where he leads the Catalyzing Neighborhood Investment Strategy. His portfolio creates the enabling environment for disinvested communities to attract, retain, and own investment. Prior to this role, Mr. Davidson was the Trust's Senior Program Officer in Sustainable Development. During his tenure at the Trust, he has been involved in the creation of such bold initiatives as Elevated Chicago, Community Desk Chicago, Food Land Opportunity, Localizing the Chicago Food Shed, the Pre-Development Fund, and Great River Chicago. Our next speaker is Bernard Lloyd, who is founder and president of Urban Juncture, Inc., and Urban Juncture Foundation, social enterprises focused on revitalizing urban communities. He leads the Build Bronzeville Project, a collaborative effort that uses deeply rooted community assets, including cuisine, culture, and history, to revitalize commerce and rebuild community in historic Chicago neighborhood. Build Bronzeville initiatives, including the Bronzeville Incubator, Boxville, Bronzeville Cooking, the Forum, and Engage Bronzeville are transforming the retail areas adjacent to the CTA Green Line transit hubs at 51st and 43rd Streets. And finally, Jordan Bailey, who's an associate of land use and planning and equitable transit-oriented development at MPC, supporting a wide range of initiatives. He is a registered architect in Illinois with a background that overlaps architecture, design, and planning. Jordan worked on architecture and development projects at a range of different scales in Chicago prior to pursuing and receiving a master's in planning and public policy from the University of Illinois, Chicago. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who will be providing an overview of the goals and support of the Chicago Community Trust in funding this project.
Thanks, Christina. I'm really glad to be here today. And quite frankly, I'm pretty excited to see this new web tool in action. As everyone can see on the slide, I lead the Trust's neighborhood investment strategy, which is a pretty large body of work that includes everything from grant making to civic leadership. And the aim of all of it is to help close the racial and ethnic wealth gap, which is our 10-year strategy. And we're about 3 years into that. This project was a natural fit for us because, as we all know, neighborhood investment does not happen in many of the communities that we're focused on without some type of development incentive or public subsidy. But the question always is, which one or ones? Are they the same? Are they different? How do I even understand what they are and where are they? Are they sized to neighborhoods? Are they sized to corridors, parcels, census tracts? I don't know. So any easy, accessible, intuitive tool that can help us and the neighborhoods, particularly the neighborhoods, understand how to sift through some of these incentives was an easy, it was an easy yes for us. And we were more than happy to make a grant to MPC to build it. But it was also important that we be more than a grant maker. MPC was gracious enough to invite us into the design process for the tool, and we provided plenty of feedback. We asked many of the community-based organizations we partner with to also weigh in. After all, these are the groups that often know these incentives best, or they should. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we knew the tool would shine a light on where these incentives are permitted and how and where they've been used and monetized. And the maps on the site are excellent. So it's a tool like this that will allow the trust to shape its own policy agenda and partner with many of you on your policy agendas as we all work, however haltingly, towards systemic change. So now I'm going to hand it back to Christina, who I think is going to introduce our friend and colleague, Bernard Lloyd of Urban Junction. Christina?
Thanks, Mike. You did a really nice job setting the stage and sharing the importance of this project and the role of the trust in supporting this work. As you mentioned, I'm going to turn it over to Bernard Lloyd, who will be sharing his view on the value of incentives in supporting economic development.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Mike Davidson and the Chicago Community Trust for funding this project. Christina Harris, Jordan Bailey, Dan Cooper, and the other NPC staff members for doing the work to assemble information and develop the website that brings us here today. And the group of advisors that met every few weeks for about a year to help shape and guide this effort. That team included community developers, such as myself, in the trenches doing the work, consultants and other professional advisors who facilitate the work, and several experts from academia who brought a broad perspective and deep analysis to these issues. In my own work, we have used tax increment financing, new markets tax credits, historic tax credits, neighborhood opportunity fund resources, and tried to use small business improvement funds. We do this work because we love Chicago, because we see incredible talent in our communities that requires investment to unlock, investment that in so many cases, and often for so many decades, has not been there. We've used TIF, new markets tax credits, as well as HTCs, historic tax credits, in a very complex capital stack that also included state funding, as well as foundation, CDFI, and private resources. And we've used NOF at the center of a very simple stack, alongside owner and landlord financing. In both cases, the public incentives were critical to our ability to complete the stack and get the project going. There simply wasn't enough, there simply weren't other sources of reasonably priced capital available for us to access. It is also true that in our experience, the city incentives made it very difficult to actually get the project finished. The incentives in total weren't sufficient given all of the challenges in our neighborhood, and the constraints governing their use made them difficult to deploy efficiently. This website is the beginning, not the end, of the equitable financing incentives discussion. It paints pictures of the allocation of financial incentives by community area, census tract, or ward that give us individually a greater ability to understand the data and the incentive tool behind it, and the power to go deeper, to download the data, coming soon, download the data behind the picture, one of the suggestions that came from the advisory group. And we present some findings. For example, that our incentive programs do not center equity in their processes or outcomes, and recommendations that demand a collective response. Thank you for joining us in this discussion.
Thanks, Bernard. It was really great for you to set the stage and share why there is a need for incentives to be used to advance equitable development and the value of including stakeholders in creating these recommendations for improvements. Jordan is now going to walk us through a demo of the website to show what is included on each and every page, and with a particular emphasis on the information contained within the mapping tool. Following this, we are going to have some, I would say, mentee-assisted conversation around the recommendations. So Jordan, take us away.
Great, thank you, Christina. So as Christina said, the first part of the presentation today, I'm going to kind of focus on providing some brief background information on the Equitable Incentives Project generally. So I'm going to walk us through kind of the goals and the process, and then ultimately the major takeaways from the initial research phase. And then the star of the show, provide a demonstration of the Equitable Incentives website, which is really the culmination of that research. So first, let's talk a little bit about the project goals. MPC's Equitable Financial Incentives research was really designed to better understand how equity is centered in the way that the city of Chicago uses financial incentives to attract investments to communities. So we looked at how and where 6 specific incentives have been used in Chicago, and whether that funding has gone to areas that are considered economically disadvantaged. So we'll talk more about this in detail, but our definition of disadvantage was based on a number of socioeconomic factors that indicate long-standing symptoms of disinvestment. So this research was really designed around accomplishing the following goals that you see on the slide. First is just to provide basic information about the 6 public funding sources that are classified as incentives. So we'll talk about more in a second, but the 6 incentives that we're looking at for this work and on the website are tax increment financing, TIF, the Small Business Improvement Fund, Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, or NOF, property tax abatements, new market tax credits, and community development block grants. So there's information exists in multiple locations, but it often doesn't provide a kind of simple, clear definition of how and where incentives can be used, or what some of the intended outcomes are, or additional background on the incentive and things like, links for applying or finding out more information. So the first goal is just to create this educational piece. Next is to really understand how equity has or has not been a driver of incentive use. So although equity is not typically an explicit goal of a lot of incentive programs, there's narratives around this, right, within the media and amongst community organizations and stakeholders, that question the fairness of these programs, right, particularly since they rely on public resources. So we really believe that these investments should prioritize equity. Third is to provide a clear, accessible picture of where and how incentives have been used in Chicago for the past 10 years. So this information, again, is not really readily accessible to the average resident. There's data available on kind of individual incentives that you can download, but it makes it difficult to understand, the total amount used in any one area across multiple incentives. So again, we believe that, this information should be aggregated and accessible to everyone so that we all have a better understanding of how and where financial incentives are being provided. The next goal of this work is to determine whether incentive use aligns with socioeconomic factors that can indicate areas of advantage or disadvantage. So we'll see this on the maps when I go through that on the website, but this research provides a kind of simple framework for showing how much and how often financial incentives have been used in areas that have those factors that indicate disadvantage. So we believe that creating an index and tracking incentive use is really critical to crafting recommendations and policies with a sharper focus on those areas of a disadvantage. And last is to identify recommendations to improve incentive programs in collaboration with advisors. So as Christina said, this is going to be a large piece of the second half of the presentation where we're going to go through these recommendations, but we developed those through the advisory group and other external reviewers, and they really provided clear direction that incentives should be refined to ensure that local and small business owners and entrepreneurs are able to access those resources, and that those resources and their use is tied to equitable outcomes for neighborhoods and residents. So our recommendations, which I'll cover, focus on strategies to achieve this. All right, so I've already listed, but what incentives does this project look at, right? So our incentive programs were selected for this project based on an initial scope of work that was actually created back in 2019. And that scope included identifying multiple types of programs beyond the final 6 that you're seeing here. That included, additional state and federal incentive programs, things like bond programs, other types of development funding. Ultimately, we finalized the list of 6 incentives that you see here based on the availability of public data so that we could build out the tools that we'll walk through in the second half of this presentation. So those 6 incentives, again, just a reminder: tax increment financing, or TIF, Small Business Improvement Fund, or SPIF, Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, or NOF, property tax abatements, PTAs, New Market Tax Credit, NMTC, and Community Development Block Grants, CDBG. So I also just kind of want to talk a little bit about the process. So before we get into the website and the recommendations, how did we get to this point? So it began with research, right? Along with the formation of an advisory group, this project started with that kind of initial research, and that included literature review, precedent review, looking at how and where similar or different incentives are being used in other cities across the country. That research phase also then included, gathering, sorting, aggregating that publicly available data that we were able to get on the 6 incentives. So that data was then mapped in GIS and to begin to kind of understand where and how incentive funding has been used in Chicago over the last decade. The second part of this process has been outreach. So we assembled an advisory group to help guide the research and inform the recommendations. And that group met 8 times over kind of a calendar year between 2021 and 2022, and spent time, reviewing the initial research findings and discussing ways to kind of improve incentive programs. And that group really played a critical role, regularly engaging in discussion with each other as well as with the MPC team, asking challenging questions, to shape the research and the findings and the recommendations. That advisory group individuals were representing a wide range of sectors, by design. So wide range of expertise and perspectives. The idea that we could try to provide a more complete picture of incentives and engage in new thinking about how their use can become more equitable. In addition to the advisory group, this research was reviewed with a group of organizations that received funding from the Chicago Community Trust, as Mike talked about, from the Catalyzing Neighborhood Investment program area. So that group similarly provided input on the initial findings and recommendations, in addition to the advisory group. We also presented this research to the City of Chicago's Offices of Equity and Racial Justice, and Economic and Neighborhood Development, and the Department of Planning and Development. And DPD it's generally the department that manages most of the financial incentives that we're talking about today. Okay, so before I move into the website demo, I just want to kind of set the stage with some of these key findings and challenges that we need to be addressed. And these are really born from that research and that outreach. So the goal of this work and this project was not to provide recommendations on how to eliminate incentive programs or anything like that, nor was it to examine whether, specific incentives, for example, TIF, produce benefits in one area over another area. What we heard from the advisory group and from external reviewers was that, these project goals should really focus on ensuring that equity is in the process and the outcomes around the use of financial incentives. So by refining the programs and making the data more transparent and usable for advocacy organizations and government stakeholders, then progress can be made on promoting development in historically disinvested communities. So you'll see on the slide the key findings from this research. And these are really challenges, right, which were being addressed as part of the recommendations. So the first one is that, incentive programs do not center equity in their processes or outcomes. Generally, the way that allocation and distribution works, it does not consider factors of disadvantage or market types. Outcomes for promoting equity have not been defined specifically for most of the incentive programs. And that from what we found in our research, really NOF is the only incentive that kind of tracks with factors of disadvantage. And we'll see that on the maps in a second. Next is that incentives are difficult to access for applicants with resource constraints and limitations. So this really gets at the process of incentives, which we'll talk about more. But many small businesses, developers, they don't have the time, the money, the resources to devote to obtaining these incentives. Bernard kind of touched on this in his remarks, right? There's a high barrier to entry. There's a lot of administrative processes that applicants have to navigate. And even if they do get to the point of receiving funding or announcing that they've received funding, there are additional challenges around the time frame of when that money is received to keep especially smaller projects viable. And the last kind of challenge that we've keyed in on here is that the outcomes and impacts of incentive use in Chicago are unclear. So there's not aligned outcomes across incentives. There's not accountability measures that consider equity when awarding incentives. And there's not really consistent tracking or reporting on those outcomes metrics for incentive programs as a whole. So with that, I'm going to move into the website demonstration. Let me jump over here. So you should have all hopefully received a link to the website. This is the homepage for equitableincentives.org that went live, fully live yesterday. So I'm just going to kind of work through the homepage, and then we'll work our way through the different pages on the website and talk through each of those. So this is the homepage. You can see across the top, there are navigation tabs. Home is where we are right now. There's a map page, there's recommendations, and there's about as well. We also wanted this site to be, as accessible as possible. So you'll see in the kind of right corner, there's this Espanol button. That's for translating the website to Spanish. So every page that we look through in the next kind of 20 minutes also has a Spanish version as well. So I'll just start right at the top, the main headline: let's make how we fund development in Chicago work for everyone. So we've kind of talked through this already in the slides, but I'm just going to read the sort of thesis sentence here at the top. And that is that equity should be at the center of how development is supported across the city. Every neighborhood in Chicago should provide residents with the opportunity to thrive. And financial incentives should be used to ensure that all communities have good jobs, access to transit, parks and open space, affordable housing, retail, and entertainment. So this interactive website provides information on where and how financial incentives have been used over the last 10 years or so, and advocates for changes to root programs and processes and equity. So as you scroll down, you'll see links on the homepage that correspond with the navigation tab. So first is the map, which you can access by clicking on the link here or on the image. Next is a link to read our resource or recommendations. So that's a page with the recommendations, as well as a downloadable PDF of the executive summary for all of this work. Next is a link to a survey. I'll talk about this survey a little bit more on the recommendations page, but the idea is that the survey would engage users with the recommendations. So we'll talk more about that when we get to it. And then next is links to the individual incentive pages. So I'll also talk more about these when I get to them, but this is that education piece, that kind of first goal, just providing a level setting about the different incentives. So let's start with the interactive map. You can access that by clicking on the image or the link, or from anywhere on the site by clicking on the map tab. So here we're on the map page. Explore where funding has gone and where support should go. So the first thing you see here, right, are two maps of Chicago. The blue map on the left is the factors map. I mentioned it briefly, but that approximates disadvantage or advantage, right? So the orange map on the right is then the incentives map. So that shows where the 6 incentives have been used in the city. So on the blue map, the darker the blue, the higher number of factors, the more disadvantage. On the orange map, the darker the orange, the more money has been spent there across all 6 incentives. So the blue factors map, let's dig into this a little bit more. So this was developed by MPC, and it's based on the 10 socioeconomic factors. And those factors form an index to identify specific areas for equitable development. So that index is based on kind of both longstanding indicators of disinvestment in Chicago, which I'll talk about, but also kind of an additional consideration of where development is, most efficient. So for example, an area with a greater density or higher density might be prioritized due to more residents benefiting from one single development. These factors that we use to develop this map are also consistent with literature, how other cities define variables related to disadvantage. And I'll run through them really quickly. We'll talk about this more later, but the 10 factors that create this blue map are lower income, higher poverty, predominantly renter, lower home values, greater share of non-white population, higher vacancy rates, higher subsidized housing, higher density, fewer businesses, and less development activity. So that's what went in to this map on the right, or on the left, I'm sorry. And then on the right, let's dig into this map a little bit more, the incentives map. So this map, as I said, shows where the 6 incentives that we're looking at have been used in Chicago over the last decade and to what extent. So the 2 maps are interactive and they're connected. So you can organize by geography, and you can see the buttons at the top, or by financial incentive program. So if you select community areas, both maps will switch over to community areas, similar with census tracts and with wards. You can also navigate by incentive program at the same time. So that's the buttons here on the right. Right now we're looking at total investment. So that's all 6 incentives that we've looked at. But you can also look at just TIF, or the way the city breaks out TIF as infrastructure and redevelopment, and then the other incentives down the line, new market tax credits, NOF, PTA, and SPIF. So there's a lot of interactive, and you can kind of really dig in and play with these maps quite a bit. Another interactive piece of these maps, which you may have seen pop up as I've kind of been running my cursor over, but there's a hover function. So this gives you additional specific information about a certain geography, right? So right now I'm looking at Bridgeport. It's telling me that that has 3.9 out of 10 factors. And then on the right, it gives additional information about, right now we're looking at TIF redevelopment. So how much money has been spent over the last 10 years, how many projects, how they break down public versus private, for-profit versus nonprofit, and then by project type. So of those 12 projects that we're looking at, you know, what percentage are commercial, what percentage are park, what percentage are mixed use, et cetera, et cetera. So an upcoming feature that is not live right now, but we're working on and will be updated, is the ability to download that data specifically. So you could be in the Near West Side in this case, and you could download that data just for TIF and the Near West Side as an Excel spreadsheet. So that's something that we're working on. Also located on the map page is this dot scatter plot at the bottom. So this uses the same data as the maps. It just shows basically how community areas or wards compare to the citywide median. And this is similarly interactive. So right now it's showing us that we've selected TIF redevelopment in community areas. If I switch to wards, the scatter plot will also switch to wards. And it also, since it's just kind of a field of dots, there's a search box. So in this case for wards, you can select if you know what your ward is, and it will highlight that and show you exactly where it falls. That also works for community areas as well. So you can see it shift around, and let's say you can type or select Forest Glen, and it shows Forest Glen highlighted. So there's a lot to play around with on these maps. And that was the point, to be an interactive tool. With that, I'm going to move to the next tab, which is recommendations. So this page, like I said, it includes this orange button, which is a PDF of our executive summary. So that's, I think, 6 pages, but it provides all this information in kind of an executive summary, if that's something that's interests you. There will also be an upcoming link to a white paper, which will accompany this work. It kind of expands on the detail that's shown on the website and talks a lot more about the methodology and how we created these maps. So I'm going to talk a lot about the recommendations in kind of the second half. As Christina mentioned, we're going to be doing some polling and dig into those. But for now, this is just to kind of show you where they're located on the website. So this page lists the high-level findings, which we talked about already. That was the last slide that I showed. Excuse me. And it also has the 10 recommendations. So you can see that the recommendations are organized under 5 headings. Those are develop and track outcomes, prioritize and align incentives to achieve equity, ease the application process, streamline funding and communication, and improve accountability. The idea with how the website is set up is that users can engage with these recommendations at kind of multiple levels of detail, depending on what they need or what their interest is. So you can see they're broken out under their 5 headings, and then there's 2 recommendations below each heading. And what's shown right now is just a simple single sentence for what that recommendation is, right? So if someone wants to just kind of quickly read through all 10 recommendations, they can do that. You can also click on each recommendation or on the plus sign, and a box will open up below with additional information on that specific recommendation. So we're not going to dig into this right now. That's really for the second half of the presentation. So I wanted to kind of move on and talk a little bit about the About page before we get to that. So you'll see the About tab has 3 subpages. There's Overview, Methodology and Process, and Incentive Programs. So let's just start with Overview really quickly. So this just gives some basic background on the project. It has the project goals, which we talked about on the slides as well. And then it has just a project's contacts and contributors. So that includes the team that worked on it, as well as a link to the contributors document. And that has everyone that has contributed from the advisory group, the CCT cohort, interviews we've done, et cetera, et cetera. The next page is Methodology and Process. So this page goes into some detail about the advisory group process, about how data was compiled, how it was categorized here, how it was aggregated, how it was transformed. Some additional information on that socioeconomic factors index, that's the blue map that we talked about, kind of how those factors were derived, and then some definitions as well. So really quickly, I'm not going to read through all of this information, but the data compilation, the data was compiled, as we said, from publicly available data sources. So that's primarily different data portals, the City of Chicago, Cook County, HUD, things like that. Then it was collected and then mapped as point data in GIS. And that was really the initial phase of what became the maps that we've already talked about. So aggregated across geographies and shown in a way that is not available currently. So the last page is the incentive programs page. Now this is really, again, this is getting at that kind of educational goal. So this is supposed to be an educational tool for users. It includes some kind of general background on incentives, as well as the links to the individual incentive pages for the 6 incentives that we're looking at. And I'll talk about those in a second. I also want to point out this section here. So we're linking out to our collaborator Cityscapes incentives tracker tool. That link is here, as well as duplicated here. And that tool is much more focused. It allows users with this link can access that tool without a prescription or a subscription, excuse me. And that tool allows you to basically, if you have a specific parcel or property in mind, address or PIN or something like that, you can see then, okay, with this specific parcel, how many of these incentives would be applicable to that. So unlike our maps, which are much broader and citywide, this is really a kind of hyper-focused tool. So we did want to link that out from here as well. And then, of course, these are not the only 6 incentives, right? We've got lots of questions. What about this incentive or what about that incentive? So as I said earlier, we started out with a much broader list and kind of narrowed down based on scope and availability of data. But this review could certainly expand in the future, to include additional incentive programs. And we've listed some here with links to provide just additional information for people coming to the website. So last, before we dig into the recommendations, I just want to show, so we have these incentive fact pages, and they're all the same, they're all organized the same, so I'm not going to go through all 6, but I'll grab just TIF as an example. So these are not meant to be exhaustive. Certainly for TIF, there's a lot of information available out there, just to provide a kind of level setting for someone who comes to this site and is maybe interested in a specific incentive. So it just highlights, what is TIF very briefly, how does it work, where and how can it be used, and what are its intended outcomes. And it includes some of the maps that we've done, to sort of illustrate that information. So in this case, where can TIF be used? Here's a map of the different TIF districts as they stand. And then where has it been used? This is the same map that we saw on the map page, but for TIF specifically. And these pages also have some additional information about, the value range, the date range, the number of projects, and some links to additional resources in that kind of interest of education, additional resources on the city pages, as well as how to maybe apply for some of these incentives. So with that, I am going to jump us back to the presentation. We've walked through the map. I'm not sure, Christina, if there are any questions that have popped up. This might be a good time to answer those.
Yeah, I think Dan and I have been doing a pretty good job of answering them live as we've been going along, but I did want to call out a couple of questions that I think would be important just to share with the group, just in case they're not checking on the Q&A box. There's a question on the limit for this project for 10 years, as opposed to going back to all the data that we've had, TIF started in the 80s, so there's a lot more data associated with that. As Dan responded, we wanted to compare all of the 6 incentive programs across like a centralized time period. And then we also had some data limitations on how far back we could get data for some of the other incentive projects. So if we were just looking at TIF, we might have picked a larger time period, but since we were looking at these 6 incentives, we wanted to select a time period where we had information and data on all of them to the best of our ability. And then I also wanted to address the data limitation question that someone raised in the chat around whether or not some of the data could be skewed to the loop based on how development projects are documented. And so we have a note in there, at least about community development block grants, because most of the data shows the location of where the organization is headquartered. And so we did try to note those data limitations within the map page, but also on the methodology page where we had them. So I would say make sure you read those captions because we tried to note where the data was from and the challenges there.
Great. Okay. So with that, I'm going to move us into kind of the second half of the presentation, which is really focused on the recommendations specifically. And as Christina said, we're going to do some interactive polling here and kind of really dig into these recommendations. But before we start that, I just want to kind of set the stage and provide some information about kind of how did we get here, right? How did we get to this point in these recommendations that we have? So this diagram on the screen shows a kind of early version of how we began thinking about developing the recommendations, right? Really talking about how equity is both embedded in the process and in the outcomes. So you can see that in the kind of green and blue pillars here on the map. Also thinking about, from the discussions with the stakeholders in the advisory group, the different themes that were coming up, and using that and the challenges that we developed that we talked about in the earlier slide, that incentive programs don't center equity, that they're difficult to access, that the outcomes and impact are unclear, using those as kind of an iterative process to form the recommendations and work through those. So again, here are the kind of 5 headings for the recommendations. So before we get into the individual recommendations, I just want to highlight these again. We're looking at develop and track outcomes, prioritize and align incentives to achieve equity, ease the application process, streamline funding and communication, and improve accountability. So these draft recommendations, they're really designed to be implemented kind of holistically across the entire development incentive infrastructure in Chicago. So in other words, that you'll see when we get into them, they're somewhat broad in the sense that they're not targeting specific incentives. And we're going to start digging into these recommendations a little bit more. Okay. So as I said, we're going to get into some interactive polling here in a second. I'll explain that when we get to it. But first, I just want to kind of read through all the recommendations, give everyone an idea of what we're going to kind of be walking through in a more detailed level. So once again, you can see the 5 organizing headers here listed: develop and track outcomes, prioritize and align incentives to achieve equity, ease the application process, streamline funding and communication, and improve accountability. So under develop and track, first is develop outcomes around increasing equity and align with citywide goals and values. And the second is to report on outcomes in a transparent and effective way. Under prioritize and align incentives to achieve equity, the first recommendation is to identify priority areas to achieve city goals and objectives for equity. And related to that is to align incentive use with those priority areas and outcomes determined by criteria that includes equity. And don't worry, we're really gonna kind of drill down on these and go into detail on each one. I just wanna get all 10 out and so that we can start from there. So next, under ease the application process, the two recommendations are to fund and support a technical assistance liaison role and create a common and streamlined application for all incentives. Under streamlined funding and communication, these are similarly kind of process-based recommendations, but provide a quicker review and better communication around funding. Provide bridge funding as part of the allocation for smaller awardees, especially when resource needs and disbursement do not align. And then finally, under improve accountability, we have require centralized reporting across all programs that use financial incentives and develop a civic oversight committee to annually review incentive use across the different programs. So with that, let's scroll back up and let's start really digging into these recommendations individually. So under develop and track outcomes, we have develop outcomes around increasing equity and align with citywide goals and values. So outcomes really need to be clearly defined for how incentives will build healthy communities across Chicago, right? So when defining these outcomes, it's important that the policymakers understand that communities are different, right? The outcomes may need to be tailored to specific parts of the city. It's unlikely there will be some kind of one size fits all approach. But ultimately, those outcomes should align with citywide goals, right? Values, ongoing planning efforts. A great example of which, if you're not familiar, is the We Will Chicago plan that's currently underway. Some outcomes could include things like building neighborhood wealth or general neighborhood well-being, economic development, like revitalization of commercial corridors. Maybe some metrics that measure those outcomes might be things like units of affordable housing or living wage job creation, change in household income, etc. So these outcomes and measures will, again, vary by neighborhood, but there's likely to be common ones across multiple areas as well. So the second recommendation here under develop and track outcomes is report on outcomes in a transparent and effective way. So, right, the next step after developing the outcomes is reporting on those outcomes, right? Putting those outcomes to use. So this recommendation really calls for developing some kind of incentive dashboard to report on those outcomes and projects that have used incentives. So those reports, should be again at multiple scales, provided at the level of the city and individual neighborhoods. That dashboard could include some very basic data across the board, right? Things like, number of projects, dollar amounts, project size, expected and realized outcomes, things like that. And that information should be tracked as a part of this, right? Posted publicly, potentially presented at a semi-annual public meeting, and really give the opportunity for questions and answers from interested residents and stakeholders. So with that, we've looked at these first two recommendations under develop and track outcomes. And now we're going to switch and do some of the interactive polling. So for those of you who haven't used Menti, you can go to menti.com, MENTI, and it'll prompt you to enter the code that you see here on the screen. You can do this either in another browser on your computer or on your phone. Personally, I find it easier to do on my phone, so I'm not switching back and forth, but either will work. So if you can go to menti.com, enter the code 39728519, and go ahead and hit the thumbs up button when prompted, and then we know that everyone's joined, and we'll start asking you some questions. And if you're having any issues joining, just go ahead and I guess we'll have to make a comment in the Q&A. I guess we don't have the chat. But it looks like we're having some good luck, 25, 26 people. So. I'm just going to wait another second or so. It looks like we have about a third of the total participants have joined, maybe a little more than that. And we are going to be kind of jumping back and forth. So we'll get into that in a second, but we'll be looking at recommendations and then doing some polling, looking at recommendations and doing some polling. So just don't close out when I jump back to the website. It should stay on the Menti page. All right, I think I'm gonna, looks like we still have a few trickling in, and you can join at any time. So don't feel like you're gonna miss out. So I'm gonna jump to our first question. And like I said, so here, if you get disconnected or you are still working on joining, at the top of each panel, it has menti.com, and then it also has the code again there. So we're really just asking for kind of a level of agreement, right? So we've looked at these two recommendations under develop and track outcomes. So if you could kind of rank, do you strongly agree or kind of lack support, or do you strongly disagree and you think there's low support? And I'll just give everyone a second to think through this and enter the rankings. Right, so it looks like we're kind of in the sort of low four range for both of these recommendations. I'll give it another second and let the stragglers answer. It looks like generally some higher support on report on outcomes and maybe a little bit more broken apart for the first recommendation. All right, I think we've got a consensus around 40 or so people. So I'm going to move. We have one more question before we jump back into the recommendations. And that is not a required question, but if you could, help us out, expand maybe a little bit, let us know why you ranked the recommendations the way you did. If you ranked it really low, is there something particularly that stood out to you? If you ranked it a 5, was there something that you really liked? Your answers will show up here on the screen as you enter them, so this is not required, but it would help us out just to understand why some of the rankings are the way that they are. So I'll just give everyone a second. Let's just fill in the blank. You should be able to just type in a short answer and it'll pop up here on the screen. Maybe some clarity in language, who defines what these goals are, need to do to have a predicate. I'll give people another minute or so. We don't need to dwell on this question, but it's like we're getting some answers coming in. Some assumptions about what city values actually mean. Seems like answers are still coming in. I'll give it another minute. All right, with that, I'm gonna jump us back to the recommendations. And as I said, we're gonna be kind of coming back and forth and doing this for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. So don't exit out if you have it open. If you do, you can just use the same code again to rejoin when we come back. So let's switch over to the recommendations again. So let's look now more closely at the second heading, and that's prioritize and align incentives to achieve equity. So the first recommendation here is to identify priority areas to achieve city goals and objectives for equity. So this recommendation really calls for identifying potential priority areas in the city for incentive use, and based on, kind of market conditions and socioeconomic factors indicating disadvantage or advantage. So, for example, right, some neighborhoods or communities can only support the use of incentives that are really structured more like subsidies or grants, right? A market typology aligned with socioeconomic development factors needs to be created to help structure which incentives are prioritized and, importantly, where. Also, kind of independent of these priority areas or geography, having a mission statement and a kind of clear set of goals for each incentive program would really help clarify the reason behind its use and the outcome that it's designed to achieve. The second recommendation here, in addition to defining priority areas, policies should align incentive use with those priority areas determined by criteria that includes equity. In some cases, incentive programs should act more as kind of one large pot of pooled incentives rather than different distinct buckets, allowing for greater discretion in providing them to those priority areas and areas of disadvantage. And this would require some changes, right? Potentially relying more heavily on funds that are geographically flexible, or consider changes to some of the incentives that have very strict geographic boundaries. The city is already doing this in some ways. It's implementing this strategy to pull funding from different pots to support aligned projects. This was really the way that the last two rounds of funding for the Chicago Recovery Plan grants worked. So they're kind of moving in this direction. It would just be taking that next step. Incentives should be aligned around the goals, the goal of achieving healthy mixed income communities in all neighborhoods. So this should focus on outcomes that are place specific and people specific, right? So centering the needs of both the community and its residents simultaneously. So with that, I'm going to jump us back to the polling, and we're going to do the same thing again for these two recommendations. So again, you can rejoin if you need to. Go to menti.com and enter the code 39728519. But if you are in, it's the same question for these two recommendations. So can you kind of select what extent you agree with or support each prioritize and align incentives to achieve equity? So those recommendations were identifying priority areas and aligning incentives with those priority areas. And I'll give everyone a minute. We'll wait till we get to 40 or so. It looks like kind of similar to the first round in the kind of low 4 range. Identical, no. And this is, I know I've talked briefly about the survey that we have on the website. This is similar in structure to the survey. The idea is that, we're really presenting these as draft recommendations. A lot of work and effort went into them, but we built the survey, we really want to think about, okay, what are the next steps? What are missing? Where are some holes as we think about, okay, now we're going to explore, implementation of these recommendations. So we're really continuing to try and present these as draft recommendations and gather as much feedback as possible. So this is very helpful. Looks like maybe we've slowed down just a little bit. Give it another couple of seconds. Might be it. All right, same question again here. Not required to answer, just fill in the blank. If there's something, very on the kind of negative side that stuck out to you, why you don't agree with these recommendations, what was that? Conversely, was there something that you think is really strong? We'd love to hear that as well. So I'll give people a second, and again, they'll pop up on the screen as well. I'm not sure if that's negative or positive feedback, just a period. I think this is in response to we will. Invest Southwest. That's correct. They use a lot of NOF funds, I believe. A house that's been on fire since the 80s. More specific language, that's helpful feedback. Lack of accountability around existing priority areas. That's a good point. You can feel free to keep entering. I'm going to jump us back over to the recommendations and keep moving, but this page will be open until we move to the next set of questions. So feel free to, if you have more thoughts here. Okay, so let's move now to talk about really the kind of 4 process-based recommendations that we're making here. So first, under ease the application process, the first recommendation is to fund and support a technical liaison or a technical assistance liaison role. So this recommendation calls for the city to provide resources for either city staff or potentially an outside organization to provide a technical assistance to less resourced applicants. It's important that however this role is funded, it should be continuous and consistent, right? It shouldn't be an on and off type of thing. To our knowledge, the city does provide some technical assistance in some cases. Maybe if an applicant is really close on the fence for something, they might get some help to kind of push them over the line. But that's really on a pretty limited basis. So we think that across the board, technical support should be provided to help with preparing materials or writing and submitting applications, clarifying timelines, deadlines and reimbursement, reporting on outcomes. This technical assistance could also be prioritized, right, based on maybe how closely a project aligns with city goals, maybe on the community area or the level of need, or even just, the kind of resources and ability of the applicant to successfully complete the project. So the next recommendation here is related to that technical assistance role, but really creating a common and streamlined application for all incentives. So this is similarly underway by the city in some capacity. This year in 2022, they launched the Universal Financial Incentives application, and that can be used for submitting for 4 incentive programs, NOF large, TIF, Cook County property tax abatements, and Chicago Recovery Plan community development large grants. So that's a great first step. I think, but creating a more streamlined application system, we're really calling for refining and expanding that application to make it easier for all applicants. An application that includes more than just the 4 incentive programs, maybe an initial application that provides some basic questions up front, that would help determine if an applicant could use the technical assistance or how quickly they need resources. An application that's offered in multiple languages other than English, maybe a screener application that could connect to publicly available scoring rubric. As of right now, that's not clear. It's not clear how projects are selected. So adding some transparency in the application selection process would be really important here. And then maybe there's questions as well to determine like how much support applicants might need from that technical assistance liaison role, some basic project questions to determine, does this align with existing goals or plans? That would help tie into some of the recommendations we've made already. So those are the 2 recommendations under ease the application process. And now we're going to do that same switch over to the polling. Thank you for people who have entered additional information here. But now we're going to jump to level of agreement with the two recommendations that I just ran through. So to what extent do you agree with or support each ease the application process recommendation? And those are fund and support a technical liaison role and create a common streamlined application for all. So I'll give people a minute to enter their answers, and then we'll move on to the fill in the blank question right after. In a similar kind of range here for 4.5. Like there's still a few answers coming in. Once again, if you need to rejoin, the directions are at the top of the screen. Give people just another minute. All right, looks like we're slowing down. So let's jump now to the fill in the blank question. And same question here. Again, not required to answer, but is there something that maybe you really don't like about these recommendations? You ranked them low, or something that you think is really valuable here? Maybe something in between, something that's missing that could add. So give a second for people to fill in the blank here. And then we'll talk about the last 4 recommendations. Technical assistance is key. This is really something that came from our conversation with the CCT cohort, because that's a lot of groups or organizations who have tried to apply for some of these incentives, and they've sort of run into these barriers. All right, I'll leave this open again if someone's filling in the answer still. It's hard for me to tell. I can't tell if people are still entering or not, but this will remain open while I jump back over and talk about the next 2 recommendations. So now let's talk about the streamlined funding and communication header. Right. So the first recommendation here, again, kind of related to the process-based ones above, but provide a quicker review and better communication around funding. This is related to kind of the previous 2 for increasing capacity to review applications to help shorten the timeline in receiving money for applicants. DPD, the Department of Planning and Development, should be fully funded and have adequate staff to complete reviews quickly and efficiently. Maybe that does end up requiring some kind of external organization as an alternative. But ensuring clarity and providing information about timelines, when support will be received, the process for reimbursement. This is all important, especially for smaller applicants. An internal tracking process we think would be valuable. Things like, when applications were received and, what happened for each application, when decisions were made, when the money was received, things like that, so that these things are tracked across the board and can be really clearly relayed to the applicant, right? And this would relate obviously to that technical liaison role, would likely be overseeing some of this. So the second recommendation is to provide bridge funding as part of the allocation for awardees when resource needs and disbursement do not align. So again, related, smaller applicants don't have the resources to float while they wait for funding. So in order to do something like this, the city would need to resource and manage a fund, potentially via an external organization, like a community development financial institution or a philanthropic organization, to allocate money to smaller awardees where funding is needed sooner than it can be provided, especially in kind of the pre-development phase, right? When things are just getting off the ground. We're cognizant of not trying to add additional layers to this and add burden to the applicant or the awardee. So that would probably need to work in a very specific way that, the external organization would provide money to the city to allocate to the awardee and then be reimbursed after the fact. But this is really, again, kind of targeted at the smaller applicants. So with that, we'll jump for the second to last time over to our polling. And thanks for, I think there have been a few more entries here. But let's move now to the next step, which is, again, same question. Select what extent you agree with or support each streamlined funding and communication recommendation. So 1 is strongly disagree or low support, 5 is strongly agree. And I'll give people a minute to think this over and enter your rankings. Again, a kind of similar range in the 4.5. Few lower answers and mostly higher answers. Give people another minute or so. About 15, been around 20, so give people another second just to enter. All right, seems like maybe we've trailed off a little, so let's move to the, a few more coming in. I'll give it another second. All right, with that, I'm going to move to the open answer. Same thing here, same as we've done the last 3 times. If you answered 1, what was the reason for that? Was there something that stood out? Is there something maybe that's missing or that could help add to these? If you ranked it 5, is there something that you see especially valuable? So I'll give, again, people just another kind of minute of silence to fill in the answers. Bridge funding is key. Triple bridge funding. feedback on applications, that's something we've heard a lot in our outreach, that it's not clear why some applications get rejected. Are they really close, right? Were they just missing maybe one or two things, or were they not even in the ballpark? I think that feedback would be valuable. I think, would the bridge funding be similar to what the Chicago Trust does? It could be. We're not, we're really kind of in the early stages of thinking about what implementation of these recommendations look like. I think that's kind of where we're moving next, hopefully. But it definitely could be something along those lines. Responses or feedback would be amazing. I'll give people just another minute, and then we'll move to our last two recommendations of the day. Seems like it's still clunky. There would need to be, I think, a lot of work to figure out exactly how that process would work. It's definitely true. Okay, once again, I'll leave this question open while I jump back to the other recommendations. So feel free if you're still typing. We really definitely value this feedback. So last, I'm going to talk about improve accountability. So these are kind of the final two recommendations, and the first of which is require centralized reporting across all programs that use financial incentives. That would mean, providing a comprehensive overview of all incentive programs to create this broad picture of total incentive use and what it is accomplishing, right? Kind of the next step from the maps that we've created, aggregating the past, right? So this would require, consistency in reporting mechanisms, including what is being tracked and how data is being reported. Currently, as I kind of mentioned, reporting on incentive use is provided via kind of individual spreadsheets that you can download from the data portal. That's valuable information, right? It led to this kind of analysis, but it's not easy to understand for the general public. It's not clear, the data isn't aggregated. So collecting and compiling all of that information in one place would allow for just kind of greater accessibility as well as greater transparency in how these incentives are being tracked. And then the final recommendation is to develop a civic oversight committee to annually review incentive use across the different programs. So the city should convene some kind of civic oversight committee, and this would really serve as an accountability body, right, to ensure that resources are being allocated based on the criteria, based on all these recommendations that we've made if they're implemented for priority areas, and that they're accomplishing equitable outcomes, right, kind of the ultimate goal of this work. A particular example is TIF districts, right? There should be periodic reviews and additional reporting requirements to confirm that they're actually doing what they set out to do. This advisory committee could take many forms. It, should host public meetings. It should be composed of government officials, residents, and other stakeholders. So importantly, not just appointees. The recommendations of the committee would require changes to be made to the allocation process based on their review. So those are the last two recommendations. We're going to jump to for the last time. Thanks again for filling out additional responses. So for the last two recommendations, just select on 1 through 5, to what extent you agree with or support each of the improve accountability recommendations. We'll give everyone a second, and then we'll jump to the fill in the blank question. And then we have one more Menti slide that will kind of take a global view. So it looks like Civic Oversight Committee is a little bit lower, the kind of 3 range. Yeah, much more kind of middle of the road for that one. So that will be helpful in the next question. Just a few more seconds, some stragglers. All right, let's go to, so definitely for the second recommendation, if you could kind of let us know why you ranked the recommendations the way that you did. There was a lot of kind of in the 3 range. So if you could just let us know like why you ranked maybe that one a little bit lower, that would be super helpful as we think about how to revise these recommendations. Having an oversight committee sounds great. Don't trust that the committee would be objective. There might be politics involved. Yeah, I think these are all fair comments. There would need to be a lot of kind of work put into exactly how that committee is formed and who is members on it and all of that. We're not at that level in the recommendations, that level of detail. That's really thinking about this in kind of next steps. This wouldn't be a wise use of limited resources. Inspector General, I'm seeing that pop up a few times. Maybe that's a different way to go. Maybe there's existing structures that can do this oversight. Committees that perpetuate. All right, I'll leave this open for another minute since we're getting lots of responses here. This is helpful. I think this recommendation has had the most striated reaction so far. So this is really helpful. We'll give it just a few more seconds if there's anything else. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it off to Christina to handle the last Menti slide of the day. And don't worry, this one is a little bit different than the ones we've been doing so far.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys are all mentied out. So appreciate your feedback, especially on, as part of the conversations we've had with the advisory group and then also with the external stakeholders, seen a lot of the same questions come up. And so it's really great to think about how you move into implementation, how you think about refining them. And so really appreciate all the feedback. We will definitely be reviewing it and thinking about how the recommendations should change based on it. So as just one last question, because we've also been wondering, like, what is the next step in this process? If you feel like anything is missing from the recommendations, if there's some research we should be doing that you think would be important to advance this work, what are some questions that came up for you when you were reviewing the website? This is what we want to hear from you now. So please take a few minutes and just submit some responses for anything else that this has made you think about or want to ask about. We've been trying to to answer some of the questions from the Q&A box throughout the presentation. Hope you all have been able to see them. But if there are anything else that you want us to know about, now is the time. Yeah, I think so. A request from the Civic Lab to rebut this entire program. The Civic Lab is welcome to do a rebuttal of our research and recommendations if they are interested in doing that. The idea is to have an open dialogue on a lot of these challenges and issues, not to be the sole voice, of course, on anything. This was, the project that MPC was working on around financial incentives, and everybody else is welcome to have their own project and work on it as well. Any other additional research ideas, questions around the website, the recommendations? Include the citywide dollar amounts of each incentive and what share of the total amount each represent. Overlay other data sets, open source hackathons. How can we communicate with the group after today's presentation? Yeah, so I know one of the items on the website, we have put our contact information for either me, Jordan, or Dan. So please reach out to us if you would like to talk about any of the work that's been presented here. And I think maybe either Jordan or Dan could drop our contact information into the chat. Educational component to teach residents about these incentives. Thanks, Jordan. Okay, well, please continue filling this out with any questions or recommendations or anything else you want to add about today. Otherwise, I am going to wrap us up a little bit early too. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for participating in today's webinar. We hope that the research and interactive website are helpful tools, providing you with information on incentives that is valuable in your activities and your work. We want more people to know about this website and take the survey, so please share it with others. And I am gonna drop in a link. So we've created, to make this easy to share and the information incredibly accessible, we created a user guide with the information that was covered here today. So toolkit and user guide, it provides project highlights, promotional materials, and a walkthrough of the site. We hope that you find this resource valuable. And please share widely, please ask us questions. Thank you for coming, and you can reach out to, as we mentioned, either Jordan, me, or Dan Cooper if you have any questions about this project. Have a great afternoon, and thank you for attending.